Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure to be here with you today from the standpoint of not just sharing some thoughts with you, but hopefully over the next 2 days, since I'm mostly a private sector person, learning a little bit more about how people at UNCTAD, at the World Trade Organization, in your community, look at some of the issues that I've been working on as well. And with that, let me get started. I think that let me start with a one-slide summary of the world economy from about a year ago. Clearly not the kind of picture that is very, very uplifting. And so you may wonder, is his whole talk going to be like this? I just set this up as counterpoint because what I want to get onto is, I think, 3 elements of figuring out the way forward, talking about why each of them is important, and then coming back and trying to wrap up around what this means for, hopefully, for some of the objectives that all of you are trying to pursue. So the 3 things that I'm going to talk about are understanding how global we really are, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about this. Second, understanding all the barriers that constrain trade, because again, I think, and this is not a universal tendency, but I think there's sometimes a tendency to think about these things too narrowly. And then finally, and probably most importantly, really trying to think broadly about the gains from trade, which is something that I've done a little bit of work on recently. So let me start off with something that will help me get the pulse of this audience on how global are we. What I've put up on this slide are 3 very different perspectives on the world economy. The first from the head of a major consulting firm, the second from the former CEO. There's been a lot of turnover of CEOs recently, so I've been unable to update this, describing his perspective, and the third from a journalist who's become very well known. And I'm very curious what the sentiment is in the room about which of these 3 perspectives comes closest to describing your perspective on globalization. So I'm going to, with your indulgence, and I think of this as calisthenics if you don't like voting early in the morning, I just want a show of hands, and perhaps because I'm too used to dealing with students, to be very clear, please vote for just one of these alternatives, and please don't hold out for a 4th or 5th alternative. These are the only 3 we have on the table for the purposes of this little guessing game. How many people would go with version A? Okay. Version B? Version C? Okay. So increasing intensity of preference, C is better than B, B is better than A. The first thing I'd like to suggest is that if you really did believe that there are no barriers left in the world, that the world is perfectly flat, that borders and space don't matter, then I'm sad to say there would be really no function for organizations like the ITC or the WTO. Now, the good news is that that's not exactly how the world works. And so let me just, I'm sorry I'm being so professorial this morning, but let's see how well you've been reading the world investment reports that get put out by UNCTAD. Let's play a little guessing game. Think of all the foreign direct investment that happens in the world. Divide it by gross fixed capital formation as a rough measure of all the investment going on within or across borders. What percentage do you get? And it might be useful to reflect on this and pick a number in your own mind before I move on and show what the answer is, and try and remember that number, because otherwise this isn't much fun. Everybody formed their own estimate of foreign direct investment levels divided by gross fixed capital formation. Okay, well, time's pressing on. So 9% last year, according to the latest World Investment Report, down from an average of around 12% in the first 10 years of the millennium, and maybe, based on my experiences with other groups, a little bit lower than some of you might have thought. Let me just play the same game with a whole bunch of things. So let me explain what I'm trying to do here. Telephone calls. I'm trying to ask you to guess, of all the voice calling minutes in the world, how many are accounted for by cross-border phone calls as a way of getting some rough sense of the level of internationalization of the flow of ideas through this particular medium. So again, pick a percentage, the percentage of all voice calling minutes that are accounted for by international phone calls, divided by international plus domestic. 2%? Turn to the next one. Look at people flows. First generation immigrants in the world, divided by the stock of world population. Again, be helpful to pick a percentage. This is all self-graded, by the way. 3%. We already talked about the direct investment numbers. Okay, what percentage of equity investors' portfolios are accounted for by equity in companies headquartered other than the countries that they're citizens of? Pick a percentage. Bit higher, 20%. And then finally, the number that we're all familiar with, if we're reading the WTO reports diligently, on exports as a percentage of GDP. So as you look at these numbers, I don't know what your estimates were, but I have performed this guessing exercise with a lot of other groups. Let me just show you the results of a survey that Harvard Business Review was kind enough to do for me of its readership. So the people responding are people who are involved in global business, usually at fairly senior levels. This is not undergraduate students that we're talking about. Let's look at what roughly 1,000 respondents to the HBR survey actually came up with in the way of numbers. So there is some suggestion of error here. It's not the kind of two-sided error that statisticians like to see. I've administered this survey to several dozen groups around the world, and only in one case did a group end up underestimating one of these variables, the export to GDP ratio. And third, even by the standards of a social scientist, these are large errors that we're talking about. We're talking about things being off by a factor of 2, 3, 5, or 10. Even the export to GDP ratio, if we take account of all the double counting that's built into the trade figures, we start to see that there's roughly a 2-to-1 multiple between what people's intuitions are and what the actual levels of integration tend to be. So the first point I wanted to make is that the globalization glass is not full. If you look at these numbers, the globalization glass is maybe 10 or 20% full. And the question is, can we figure out a way of making it fuller than it currently is, which is the second topic I want to turn to. So what's behind these relatively low numbers that we saw on the previous slide? Obviously, trade economists have spent a lot of time focused in particular on what they call the mystery of the missing trade. And here, since this will be familiar to many people, I've just summarized very quickly what the mystery of the missing trade is. The mystery of the missing trade has to do with the observation that if you take, say, a Canadian province like Ontario, look at how much it trades with another Canadian province like, say, British Columbia, versus how much it trades with a US state, say Oregon, which is roughly as far from Ontario as British Columbia is, has roughly the same economic mass as British Columbia. So what people have looked at is the home bias the ratio of Ontario-British Columbia trade to Ontario-Oregon trade, because if borders did not matter very much, we'd expect this ratio to be close to unity. A long-standing, and this is the topic of literally hundreds of papers now in the trade literature, has sought to unpack the mystery of why, back in 1988, the home bias was 20 times, this is not 20%, this is 20 times as much trade between Ontario and British Columbia as between Ontario and Oregon. And while NAFTA has brought this down, all the estimates that I've seen recently of the home bias ratios are still in the 5-to-1 to 10-to-1 range, and actually jump up quite significantly if you look beyond merchandise to actually think about services as well. Further deepening the paradox is that we see large amounts of home bias, despite the fact that the US and Canada, along many dimensions, at least from an external view, are not that far apart. So if we think about it, we're talking about here NAFTA, we're talking about common border, mostly common language, mostly a common colonizer, which has also been shown to increase trade levels, and a political climate that, you know, is perhaps at times has its wrinkles, but is certainly not the most hostile kind of political climate that we can imagine, because this is described as the world's longest undefended border, suggesting that there's a basic degree of comfort and trust on both sides of the border. So think about the fact that if there is still so much in the way of obstruction to US-Canadian trade, how large the barriers that arise between two randomly selected countries might be. And if you're having trouble thinking about that, I'll show you the only statistical results I'm going to inflict on you this morning. I did using the World Trade Organization data, create a giant matrix looking at all possible bilateral pairs of countries. The trade between a pair of countries was the dependent variable. And then after controlling for things like economic size and distance, I tried to figure out what the differential impact of similarities versus commonalities on various dimensions was. So to help you interpret this chart, what this chart's saying is if two countries speak the same language, trade between them is going to be almost 50% higher, based on my estimates, than trade between two otherwise similar countries that spoke different languages. Common regional trading bloc helps. These are lower than the estimates that some other people have gotten. In general, these are low estimates rather than high estimates. But again, helps pump up trade significantly.